All right, we will do this a little bit differently than the previous panel. This is a panel on research. I'll have everyone give a brief introduction of what they work on. I'll first introduce the panel. I'll start on the end. Ellen Wohl is a professor of geosciences and focuses on geomorphology. She is a CSU Distinguished Research Professor. Next to her is Melinda Laituri, who is an emeritus professor with the Watershed Science Program in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability. Brad Udall, beside me, is a senior water and climate scientist and scholar with the Colorado Water Center. And then online we have Perry Cabot, who is also with the Water Center as a research scientist and CSU extension specialist. He's now in the Grand Valley in western Colorado. So I'll give each of the panelists a few minutes to just give an overview of their research and the key questions that they have been thinking about and trying to address, and then we'll go from there. So, Ellen?
Okay. Yeah, you can hear me. Okay, so Stephen asked us to focus on a couple of questions. The research and key questions that we're working on, as Stephen mentioned, I'm a geologist and I'm what's called a geomorphologist, so I look at process and form, mostly physical process and form in rivers. And I'm particularly interested in factors that enhance resilience and storage of water, sediment, and carbon in river corridors, and I use that phrase to refer to channels and floodplains. So basically, what kind of natural features enhance storage of the things we would really like to have more of, like water, or we would like to take out of the atmosphere, like carbon. And I really have kind of a hierarchical approach. So I look at geological factors that influence the configuration of valley floors as you go down through a river network. Basically, you're not going to get much storage unless you have a wide, low gradient portion of the river, as opposed to a bedrock gorge. And then within those portions of the river corridor, I look at some of the factors that are either natural or that we can enhance through management. For example, natural storage features like beaver dams or well-developed floodplains that are connected to the active channel rather than isolated from it. And I think that the key questions for me are, first, how can we foster resilience to what I think of as the ongoing challenges that would be mainly human consumption of water and climate change, and then the more discrete sort of extreme events, so flood, fire, drought are the key examples. And I'm part of a group right now that has funding from the Walton Family Foundation to look at the distribution of these natural storage features in the Colorado River, the entire watershed, and then make recommendations for management activities that can foster some of those. And the last thing I'll say is that I tend to focus on the smaller rivers, and you might think, well, the Colorado is not a small river. If you look at any river network in terms of total channel length, something like 70 to 80% of the total channel length is in the smallest rivers. It's those headwater rivers that have no tributaries or only very small tributaries. So what we do on those small channels has a very important cumulative effect. And I know probably most of the talks and most of the thinking at a meeting like this are going to be focused on the main stem or the big tributaries, but the little guys add up in the long term. So that's where a lot of my focus is.
Thank you. Melinda?
Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks for having me here, and I've really appreciated all the discussions so far about the Colorado River. I think something so critical for us to think about right now is a sense of urgency, that we really have to address the issues that are going on right now within the Colorado River Basin, within the context of climate change and what's happening around the world. And so thinking about the international context of what we can learn from what we do in the Colorado River Basin and how we can share our story with other people all around the world who are contending with very similar problems, but may also have extreme events that are going on. So I think there's 4 key things I'd like us to think about. One is to consider a permanent decrease in water use and how we use water across the basin. 2, to think that we are on the edge of a cataclysmic moment of monumental change. 3, that it's time for a just transition. And 4, that we think about the need for action research that provides solutions that we can really are tangible and that we can address. Let me ask you some questions. How many of you during the beginning of the pandemic stayed at home? How many of you during that time when you went out wore a mask? This one's more personal. How many of you were vaccinated? During this time, we demonstrated around the world the collective will to come together as a global community to address a very severe problem. If we don't think that water shortage, that drought, that situations associated with what we're contending with right now cannot be addressed collectively, we've just demonstrated that we can, albeit imperfect, albeit with limitations, but we said we could come together to demonstrate effective change, to say, what do we need to do for the future? And so that's the kind of research that I think we have to do. Very engaged research with the people who are at the front lines, the farm workers in the Imperial Valley who have limited access to housing and access to water, the city in Tijuana who's at the end of the pipeline of the Colorado River Basin. How do we ensure that they get adequate water? How do we understand how farmers invested their lifeblood and their life's family in being able to farm their entire lives? How do we modify how they do that so they can still be successful? These are the kinds of research questions we need to do to really enact change and to make things happen in a different way and to address what we can come together as a common body of people to identify how we can make solutions that are successful.
Wow, that's a tough act to follow. So my name's Brad Udall. I'm with the Colorado Water Center, and at some point would love to get into that, but let me answer the question I was posed. So what do? I work on how climate change is impacting the hydrologic cycle. And I've done work both nationally and somewhat internationally, but especially as it pertains to the Colorado River. One effort was early on was looking at global climate models and how useful are they, and why do they give us such varying results? Other work has been on how big a risk does the Colorado River have to declining flows, and how's that risk changing through time? And more recently, just this year in Science, along with some other folks, published an article on how you can stabilize this system. In the early 2010s, I worked on Dust on Snow with a number of other authors. And at that point in time, it was quite clear that dust was impacting runoff, and so we tried to quantify it, both in terms of flow reduction and in terms of timing as well. Another effort that I worked on, along with other scientists, was how is hot drought impacting the river? Up until 2018, most scientists thought that the decline in river flows was mostly due to higher temperatures. And so there was a body of work on trying to quantify how the flow declined as the temperatures rose. What we've seen since 2018 are these sharp precipitation declines. 2018, the single worst year going back to 1895. 2020, awful. 2021, bad. 2022, bad. And if you look at the last 22 years, this is the single worst 22-year period with respect to precipitation. And there's now worry about what's this mean? Because for a long time, scientists have suspected we'd see precipitation declines, anthropogenic precipitation declines. And it appears that that's actually on the map right now. How does this drought differ from past droughts? Jennifer earlier today talked about aridification, and I'm one of many scientists that have tried to point out that what we're seeing here is not a drought. Not every year is warmer, not every year is drier, but there's this long-term trend toward warming and drying in the basin, and to call it a drought's actually a mistake. We really need a different mindset. A drought implies a return to something else, and we're not going to see that. So we really do need new verbiage around the system. So let me stop there. But occasionally I've sort of will get into the policy realm, and would love to talk about that a little bit too, but not right now.
All right, thank you. Perry.
Sure. Hey, Steve, thanks a lot for giving me an opportunity to talk. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. It's very busy planting time for us. And I'll be quick. And those of you that might have looked at my bio can see the 4 areas of research that the center that I ostensibly run here over in the Grand Valley is engaged in. So just to kind of summarize real quickly, an area of innovative irrigation technology, our overhead sprinkler system, a set of sonic loop between the soil environment and the system itself. And so the intention there is to actually utilize artificial intelligence to be able to inform the sprinkler system how to operate and basically learn the field as it goes through the year. So that's a focus on efficient irrigation approaches that I think are going to be critical to the upcoming challenges that we face. And so in the area of sustainable water resources management, we do use drip irrigation to the greatest extent possible. And one of the reasons why we do that is an integration, finally, of our soil resource as well as our water resource to try to rehabilitate some of our soils and not force them into furrow irrigated system, which depletes the ability of the soil to actually store water and be a form of infrastructure to allow us to be a little bit more efficient with our water resources. Alternative cropping systems is another big area that we look at here. And right now we're engaged in a project that allows us to actually set land into a pathway that we believe would allow producers to actually lease water during the summer and then actually grow winter crops. And how this would look in practice would be, let's say your May through August season. Of course, those months we know are the hottest and maybe the demand for water at that time is the greatest. If we can figure out a way to allow that land to then go into, say, a winter pulse crop like lentils or peas, we actually have the opportunity to practice some soil health principles, add a legume to the soil, generate some nitrogen, and then whether it be for a forage or a row crop harvest in the spring, we utilize these warmer summer months to allow us to grow a crop and then free up that water for a possible water sharing program on a voluntary basis. So, it's a way of sort of preserving agriculture or at the same time acknowledging the demand that water will face into the future. And the last thing I'll say is an area of consumptive use evaluation, which I'd probably refer back to a little bit later during our discussion. We're utilizing a fairly broad scale remote sensing program in coordination with the Desert Research Institute to look at the use of remote sensing as a way of estimating consumptive use over broad swath areas. The Western Slope is just dominantly irrigated pasture, and if we don't have a better handle on more standardized methods to estimate remote sensing, then we're always going to be kind of picking and choosing these little areas, and everybody's going to kind of have their own methods. So trying to sort of standardize that and translate that type of tool to broader modeling use or consumptive use, transfer or sharing use is a critical area of our research. So I'll close there, but you have your panel back, Steve.
All right, thank you. So let's think back the last 100 years. Let's think Colorado River Compact. And my question to the panelists, and I think everyone can take a minute or two and then we'll have a discussion. What are the important research questions that scientists and scholars have been asking and answering related to water over the past 100 years, especially in the context of the Colorado River Compact? So I'll go in the reverse order and start with you, Perry.
Sure thing. Well, my area is agriculture, so I'm gonna probably defer to some of the experts who have looked at the issue a little bit more long term. But I can say that measurement and what they call measurement and verification of consumptive use. I don't tend to like the word measurement because consumptive use is not a directly measurable phenomenon, at least not easily. But estimation of consumptive use I think has become more of a pressing issue so that we can, for lack of a better term, inventory the available transferable or shepherdable water into the basin as we're trying to kind of come up with this, how we're going to do this, filling Lake Powell or trying to augment the volumes in Lake Powell. If we don't have better tools to do that and make more nimble decisions, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. And I guess, I'll just leave it there and listen to the others.
So let me underscore what Perry was talking about, consumptive use, and broaden that to ET, evapotranspiration in general. And let me walk you through a good little thought experiment. So roughly 80% of what comes out of the sky in the basin goes back up into the sky. And that leaves us with 20% in our rivers. What happens if it warms slightly and the Earth's atmosphere holds more moisture and the growing season expands? And let's just say that 80% goes to 81%. What's happened to your river runoff? Well, obviously it's dropped from 20 to 19%, but that's measured as a total amount of precip. If you're a river user, what you're more concerned about is how's this new flow compared to the old flow? And so you now have 19/20ths of your old flow, or 5% less. And the lesson here is that a 1% tiny increase in basin ET use over Y overall leads to a 5% decrease in river flow. It's a really stunning leverage on how susceptible the river is to flow declines due to extra warming. Let me mention some other questions that people have been really interested in. So how's obviously the flow regime changed through time? Paleoclimate scientists have really looked hard at this, often using tree rings, and we've gotten a lot of valuable information about just how low the flow has been. And these papers continue to come out, including a new one this year that actually goes back to the 2nd century. Frequency and severity duration of not just these droughts, but floods are also of interest. There are a whole bunch of policy questions that surround the basin that sort of combine both science and policy. And I'll mention in the 1990s a big study that appeared in the Journal of the American Water Resources Association called the Severe and Sustained Drought. It was about 12 or 15 different papers that are still really valuable today. So let me stop there. But I think this whole notion of ET, getting a good handle on ET and consumptive use has always been of interest, and it will continue to be of interest. And one other little point. So we all rely, almost every scientist who works on this in this basin works on what are called the natural flows. These are reconstructed flows at Lee's Ferry, the dividing line between the upper and lower basin. And frankly, there are numbers in these reconstructed flows that everyone in this room should be a little bit nervous about, but almost all science that focuses on the flows is dependent on these. And for one notion of just how worried we might want to be is that basically they take gauge flows that we have, gauges are roughly accurate 5 to 10%, and then add back in all human changes. And in the upper basin, that's something like 800 different addition and subtractions. And crop consumptive use goes back into this. Crop consumptive use, in this case, is calculated using a really old model called Blaney-Criddle, which clearly is not cutting it in the 21st century. There's a whole effort underway called OpenET to try and get better numbers on evapotranspiration. I know Perry's been engaged in that. But at some point in time, we're going to see these natural flows upon which, all these paleoclimate studies have been based. They're all going to shift, and it's going to make people somewhat uncomfortable. I think the correlations will be very tight, but nonetheless, the absolute numbers will shift in large ways once we enhance our ability to get better ET numbers.
Thanks for that. I think what both Perry and Brad have mentioned is the need for data and how important data is for informing how we understand the river and how it flows. In the past, what we've done is we've collected data on different aspects of the river, whether it's ET, whether it's on crops and how much water is used, whether it's on water consumption in cities. We've done all these things. So we've created very excellent data sets that are siloed. And so it's very difficult to look at our data comprehensively and collectively to know how these different situations are impacting each other. And so while the United States generally has excellent data systems and creates the ability for us to do really good research on what's happening in specific locations along the river, it's much more difficult to look at it holistically across disciplines and across scales because of the way we collect the data, the sampling strategies we use, the data itself, if we use remotely sensed data that's at different resolutions, all of these things impact this. And this is a legacy we're now building upon to start to create more comprehensive data sets so that we can talk about things that have to do with something called the ecological integrity of the Colorado River Basin. What does that really mean? It's not just about evapotranspiration rates, it's not just about agricultural consumption, it's about the collective use of water across the basin and how we can analyze, model that, and begin to address that.
Okay, from the perspective of natural sciences and rivers, a lot of the research, certainly for the last 3 to 4 decades, has been on what levels, so magnitude, frequency, duration of flow, are necessary to preserve river ecosystems. And in the Colorado River, that's mainly been driven by endemic and at-risk fish species. But it's challenging because, if I imagine I was a dam operator, I could put a monetary value on a specific amount of water. If you give me X amount, I can generate this much hydropower, for example. And with rivers as ecosystems, we don't have that level of precision. So I can't tell you that if I get X amount of acre feet or X amount of CFS, I will produce Y amount of fish, or I will even be able to sustain this fish community. But that has been the big challenge, trying to figure out the flow, primarily flow, but then secondarily sediment requirements, for example, for sustaining rivers as ecosystems.
Follow up from the panel on any of those comments.
Well, Steve, I just want to, throw out the kind of play off of Brad's comments here is that, the big river impact, or, whether they're administrative or drought related, a lot of the questions I get from farmers are also related to, their own diversions, particularly related to return flows. And so when we break it down even to the smaller scale, that same question around how are these, changing ET rates or even water sharing programs going to affect maybe non-participatory neighbors, justifies the use for more data about our watersheds.
I might build on that, and also what David Robbins talked about earlier during his keynote about ag being roughly 80% of the water use in the basin. We really need to understand ag better. I mean, it's where many of these hits in use are going to occur, and we owe it to ourselves to understand how is it that we can make an ag system healthy and sustainable given what's being thrown at it. And Perry works on this, others potentially at CSU work on it. I don't, but it's something I think about a lot. Crop switching, for example. How can farmers, producers switch crops, use less water, get the same kind of returns? We need to figure this out because there's no way right now that the current water use can continue in this basin. And again, much of the reductions are going to fall on ag, and we just owe it to these folks to do a better job in that realm.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's something for us to be thinking about in that context of agricultural use and swapping out crops and things like this are the kinds of incentives that are put in place to support farmers. This is talking about food security writ large across the United States. We're dependent on the winter vegetables and cattle feed from this part of the country to provide for the rest of the country. So it's really, really an important question for everyone to understand that. I think the other issue with the other 20% and municipal limitations on water use and industrial limitations on water use, things that people can do as individuals, I think is important because it feeds the education and perception about how important water is in our everyday lives. And so it's this question of scale, of scaling down to the individual, the accountability that I have to how I manage my own water supply and what my water footprint is like. I just took out our whole lawn this last year. Should I have done that?
Yes.
Good idea? Okay, so, all right. So do we want to do those kinds of things? And that's an individual thing that I did to be able to contribute to what I think might be the greater good.
Took mine out too.
Questions from the audience on any of this, or comments from the audience?
I know that the answer to this has a lot of dollar signs on it. Is anyone looking at losses from the transportation infrastructure? Thinking back to gigantic open canals flowing through very dry California. I imagine they're old enough that they're leaking. Is anybody addressing that?
In bits and pieces, I would argue. For example, within the last couple of decades, the really big canal that takes water out of the river and runs it into the single largest user within the whole system, the Imperial Irrigation District, parts of that canal were lined when it ran through sand dunes, which at this point seems pretty obvious, right? Holistically, maybe not, but I think you point out that ag infrastructure is aging and oftentimes really leaky, and there's good opportunity for modernization there.
All right, we'll answer this one more question and then either one. And then we'll go on from there, because I think it's good to put what the issues are in perspective, but then we also, the next section, we'll look into the future.
Great, thanks for a great panel. Dave Kanzer, Colorado River District. I have been curious about unintended feedback loop of drying lands, taking out lawns, decreasing surface area of reservoirs to the hydrosphere, and wondering if you can comment on, as things get drier, will it continue to dry? Should we be doing anything differently to preserve sort of that 20% that is not going back up into the atmosphere?
Certainly trees in urban environments are critical, right? And anybody who talks about, drying urban environments at the expense of trees is nuts, as far as I'm concerned. As far as I know, countless studies just put very high value on trees in urban environments, not so much grass, but trees. So that's one area I would just mention, DK.
I think another area of research that would be really fascinating to look at would be to consider looking at remotely sensed data and how we can understand some of the thermal signatures we get to look at thermal inequities across cities and across some of the agricultural areas we're looking at, and really be putting this into a socio-ecological context that could be helping us to try to solve some of these problems and collecting some of those metrics that we don't collect, and changing how we manage our data collection regime to tell a more interesting story that we need for solving problems.
I'm going to use that as an opportunity to go to our last question, which is the big one. What are the future research questions? I think we've been alluding to that, but what do we see as our future questions, and also what advancements will we need to be able to address these questions on a local, regional, and global level? And I'll open this up for whoever wants to go first. And if no one wants to jump at it, let me know. All right, Ellen.
That's the penalty of sitting at the end. I think returning to what I talked about before, trying to understand rivers as ecosystems, the challenge is to integrate the different components. I was thinking about this when there was a question about consumptive or evaporative water loss from canals, and I was thinking about how when somebody proposes a canal or a dam, the agency that would build it usually talks about water storage and ignores water loss, and then people opposed to it say, oh, but what about all this water loss? And it's kind of the siloing that Melinda was talking about earlier. You see that in research too. It's not deliberate, but I have a model that will tell me how the physical characteristics of the river are going to change if this discharge changes. And there's a different model for the fish and a different model for the vegetation. So I see taking a more integrative approach and literally integrating predictive models as a big challenge. And that's a research challenge and an implementation challenge. The leader in this, I think, would be South Africa. They've developed something called DRIFT, which is a decision support system that looks at multiple components of rivers as ecosystems, but also how water use in different scenarios would affect human communities. So trying to continue that type of development for other rivers, I think, is a key challenge.
I think it's important to recognize the Colorado River Basin as an anthropogenic construct. We've created this beast. And so now how do we manage it? And what do we need to understand in terms of our responsibility in that management? I think another issue is to consider the role of both environmental justice and ecological integrity across the basin. Whose voices have we not heard? We've come up time and time again that Native American tribal rights, what do they mean across the basin? What do they mean across the basin? It seems like this is really, really a pivotal point for us to understand right now. So voices not heard, ecosystems overlooked, understanding soil health, understanding the importance of wetlands, the role of endangered species, the status of the Colorado River Delta, and the Salton Sea. All of these places that need to be considered together. So I think it's really big, it's really complicated, but it's also really exciting for the young people who get to come forward and start to do this kind of research and start to try to solve these problems.
So those are both really good high-level views. Let me mention a couple more low-level things that haven't come up to date. Water quality often gets lost, right? And one of the things we're seeing are these harmful algal blooms in places that we never, ever expected them. And we need to understand better how those are going to impact us in the future, what causes them, are there ways to minimize them? Soil came up, and this whole connection of soil moisture to these flow declines is an active area of research. And if you haven't been following this, what we now think is that soil moisture is acting as an inter-year buffer from one year to the next. So these really hot and warm and dry summers that are drying out soils are now impacting runoff the following year. And I've yet to see actually any papers on this, but it's super interesting to me personally. Land cover change in general is of real interest here, right? A brand new paper recently talked about how fires are actually advancing runoff by several weeks in time. And it's easy to sort of understand this, at least conceptually, right? You remove shade from the land surface, you allow the wind to be more active and sublimate snow. For sure, you're going to see a lower snow cover, more likely than not, you're going to see a lower snow cover and earlier runoff. In parts of the basin, we seem to have a transition to shrubs underway from larger trees. And there are real impacts to this. The research I've seen to date actually says this is a net negative again. So fires and this change to other forms of vegetation, generically land cover change of real interest here to all of us. And I love these holistic ideas here as well, instead of my sort of more narrow focused items. There's a lot of work to be done here. And clearly, the whole system's under unbelievable stress, both physically, but also socially. And arguably, the last 100 years, all of these agreements, the law of the river, people, Jennifer and I were just in Santa Fe last week for 3 days with every major decision maker in the basin. And I think we'll hear this from Jim Lockhead later today. I mean, these old rules, they're just not going to work. They're not working, and they're just not going to work. And how we move into a new system that's actually equitable, environmental justice, has environmental considerations built into it. It's a terrific opportunity. It's an opportunity that only comes along once in 100 years. Unfortunately, it's under really trying times, but that's usually how these kinds of opportunities present themselves.
Perry?
Steve, yeah, I love the comments that have been made. I will continue to underscore the value of the broader scale models that we need to understand the impacts of whether they be voluntary water sharing arrangements, curtailment scenarios, and drought on the return flows, because that just continues to come up in every meeting I go to. I wouldn't be engaged in the projects that I'm doing here if I didn't think they were progressive and important. And so, I'm in the ag world, and we must have an understanding going forward of how these kinds of sharing arrangements are going to be worked into traditional or new alternative cropping systems. And so that, the best example of that I have, I kind of provided before, but farmers grow things because they're marketable, right? So, they have a business that they're trying to run, and until there's a way of maintaining the economic productivity of their farm, crop switching is just a non-starter for them. But as we have these alternative crops and we can integrate water money, let's say, then you start seeing these kinds of really innovative programs. Like we have, we're looking at programs that allow farmers to, if they want to, they can utilize, a 3-year period of curtailment or water sharing to actually transition to organic agriculture. Kernza, for folks that know that word, is sort of having a moment right now where we're partnering with the Land Institute to look at perennial grains that might have lower water use needs. And that would be an example of like an alternative crop that Brad mentioned. So being able to integrate these, we are definitely, we know that the ag money knows that it's going to have to participate in sharing arrangements. How do we have a functioning agriculture while at the same time doing that? If you look at the picture behind me, you can see the very clear dividing line between the irrigated land and the non-irrigated land. And so that's, the implications of fundamentally altering that are not good. I guess the last thing I want to say is it's a little bit off topic for research, but we need to engage in what I would call more relatable kinds of programs for the public to understand the urgency of the problems that we face. With all due respect to my fellow panelists, I live in an area where some of the topics that she mentioned were not exactly uniformly and broadly received. And, I think as researchers, we tend to believe that just more education is going to change the dynamic of the narrative. And I struggle with that, because the rational thinker says if you just get the good information, you're going to make better decisions or different. And we just don't see that. And we can speculate as to why, but the best example I have, and Brad may chuckle at this, is I talked to him a few years ago about, granting our local representative people an audience with Brad Udall, the renowned climate scientist, one-on-one, just to explain to them these topics. And, I sit there and I wait for the phone to ring, and I have not received that phone call. So it's not like the information is not there, or it's available to be there. Some people just don't want it. So what are we doing wrong that we are not getting this point across? It's such an urgent problem, and yet at the same time, we treat it as if it's just such an adaptive issue that we're going to continue to muddle along without making big changes. Thanks for indulging my somewhat...
And thanks for the put down, Perry. Always helpful to be humbled a little bit.
I think those were some good comments. Any feedback on that? I mean, I think any of those topics we could drill down on, but anything that the panel feels they want to address or take further.
I guess I'd just echo Perry's comment. I think there have been lots of examples. The earliest one I can think of is lead in gasoline, going back to the 60s, where just providing more information is not enough. You have to think about how the information is communicated and people's receptiveness to it. And as scientists, yeah, I agree. Or as educators, we think if you put information out there, people will accept it, but that doesn't work, and that's been shown in lots of different contexts.
I might circle back to Melinda's opening comments about just how we are all in this together. And the only way out of this is together, right? And at the heart of that is communication. There's a lot that science has to offer here, but I think science also has to think about how we communicate and how to do it better. And this ag community that CSU needs to be so responsive to, Perry rightfully points out the barriers. And I would just kind of, I know there are people from the ag community here. Robert Sakata's right here. We need to figure out how to overcome this, how to get this information out there, and also how to learn ourselves, right? I ran a program for years at that other place down the road called a RISA, Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program that NOAA funded. And it really charged us with scientists to go work with people. Don't dispense information from on high, but actually work together collaboratively to try and figure out some of these solutions. It's sort of outside the standard university higher ed model, but done right, it's really effective. I'd argue that those are the kind of models we need to look at to come up with these group-based, collaborative decisions and information that can be used here to get us out of this really big hole we're in right now.
Follow up on that. Questions or
Are you
comments?
ready for questions? We got one back here.
Thank you. I've been thinking about the 80% of the water is in the air comment that you made. And in November, Scientific American had an article about new gels that are coming out to capture the water vapor and be able to utilize that in a variety of different applications. And I know that technology is not the solution for everything, but this article highlighted the fact that there could be enough water captured in the desert to support a troop of 300 troops. And so it makes me just wonder about maybe some technology solutions to supplement the water on a larger scale than on an individual home scale that could be applied to maybe agriculture or something like that. And so I'm wondering about the technology piece and what kind of research you're aware of. I think this research was being done at the University of Austin in Texas. But I'm also thinking about what kind of unintended consequences for climate that might have if we start to take a lot of this water vapor out of the air. So lots of questions there.
I don't know that research, and I'm a little skeptical of the volumes of water involved here being really useful in the context of our problems. That would be the one comment I would make. The other comment is just around technology in general. Listen, we have a lot to learn from other folks around the world about how to use technology better in all spheres. Especially the ag, and much of this involves modernization, and that's where Perry's done a bunch of his work.
I've tried not to chime in, but I'm going to chime in briefly here. That capturing the water out of the air, I don't know that specific research either, but I think of the areas where fog interception and a majority of the precipitation actually comes from out of the air. So in areas like that, you look at the look at Hawaii, you look at the west side, when you go upslope from Kona, they get huge quantities of water, and that's related directly to why those coffee crops are grown there. But that's the different processes. So I think I think the technology is important, but I think we also really need to understand the physics of these processes, and that was mentioned earlier, where our evapotranspiration models are reasonable, but they're wrong.
So, Stephen, just you missed a good plug for something that's coming to CSU. I didn't know if you know about it. There is going to be a conference hosted at CSU, and I'm trying to remember the organizer's name, but it's actually going to be on fog harvesting and the technology behind fog harvesting. And what you described in coastal areas is appropriate, but that's actually going to be coming here next summer. So,
I wasn't trying to put shameless plugs in, so that's why I didn't say that.
hey, I'm a center director. Shameless plugs, man.
So technology, I'll throw that out to the panel. Your thoughts on, what we need and what you think we need in the context of technology and that development.
Really? You want to ask us that?
Well, I mean, I don't agree that technology is going to dig us out of this, but I think there are certain things that may be useful, or you can say no. No is an answer as well.
Well,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm going to suggest 4 books that people should read. So one book is Gaia by James Lovelock. The second book is Small is Beautiful by E.F. Schumacher. If you read that book today, it was written in 1973. It's as if it was written today. Third book is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And the fourth book is Dune by Frank Herbert. I think that's particularly appropriate for today.
So, Stephen, this is one I want to throw out because it's the statistic that's been quoted by most up there is that 80% of the water is used for ag production. And then if we look at it in technology, I think we end up limiting ourselves to think about technology in the application of delivering water to an irrigated field. But the revolution in agriculture as we know it now, started 60, 70 years ago, and it's led to the systems we have, which are bigger and bigger equipment, larger and larger scales of production. And the reason for that is labor. It's just like that was the big cost, eliminate labor, which meant bigger machinery. Well, now we have autonomous vehicles. Now we have robotics. And so I would like to think about this issue of crop switching and think of it in the context of the agricultural systems themselves changing to smaller scale, more rapid change depending on the hydrologic circumstance. That is, thinking small again, but instead of going bigger to replace the labor force with robotics and going smaller so that you're able to be much more precise in your water application, and also the ability to change crop production methods through the use of autonomous systems and robotics, as opposed to just going to bigger and bigger scales of agriculture.
I guess, Steve, I can chime in on this. Where my thinking goes in response to this question is the applicability of a lot of our subsurface irrigation systems that allow sort of zone by zone irrigation at the smaller scales that the gentleman asked about. A lot of our fields are big because the furrow irrigation that we use is designed for these kind of larger applications, and sprinkler systems are just based on the economies of scale or better done at large scales. But we have a lot of irregular fields in the Colorado, certainly the upper Colorado Basin, like you can kind of see in my picture behind here, bisected by roads and things like that. So zone by zone irrigation is something that, for farmers that were, let's say, engaged in hemp, and certainly the orchard industry has been doing this for quite a while, I think has a tremendous benefit. And as we understand moisture and data and all the things we've talked about, we can more fine tune our irrigation to the needs of whatever particular crop is being introduced there. And I guess this is the other comment to make here is it's a really valid point to talk about, just because we put in an efficient irrigation system, it does not mean that we're going to fundamentally alter our consumptive use. As we all know, you can see consumptive use increases. So if we don't marry some of these more innovative systems with different crops, we're not really going to see big consumptive use. It doesn't do much good to put a sprinkler system under alfalfa under a sprinkler system if you're expecting to gain consumptive uses or reduce consumptive use, I should say, gain conservation. However, those systems then afford the producer a more nimble kind of adaptivity. They can switch to a crop that might, suddenly have a marketable benefit to it as well. So anyway, that's just, more conversation, good comments.
Any other follow-up on the panel?
I would just add one thing. When I think about technology, I say great for technological systems, things that we have already created and are operating. I get very nervous about technology as applied to sustaining natural systems because we have a really bad track record. I'm serving on the Columbia River Science Advisory Board right now, and it was the attitude of, well, we can keep the dams as they are because we'll use hatcheries and physically move the fish around the dams, and that's been a dismal failure. Those natural stocks have completely collapsed. So I think technology is great for technological systems. I don't think we have a very good track record of using it to sustain or enhance natural systems.
I'm going to provide a few comments to summarize these things, then I'll have a few closing questions for the panel. I see, and these are in no particular order, the issue of scale. How do we go from, and that's where this question started earlier, from local to regional to global. A big thing is the integration of the different components. It's not just water, it's the ecosystems. And it is an ecosystem, and that includes the water quality, and within that ecosystem, how do we address justice and the inequities? Working together in multidisciplinary teams, interdisciplinary teams, transdisciplinary teams, because we can't just continue to live and work in our silos. The component, I'll get to this in a second, uncertainty. We talked about ET and how poor it is, how poorly estimated it is. I was just at the head gate for the San Luis Peoples ditch and looked at that structure and was wondering how incorrect that was. For those of you who can geek out on it, I saw a hydraulic jump within that partial flume, and it said, oh, that's not giving us exactly what's supposed to be there. Also thinking of the context of not just water, but how we look at it as food, energy, and water, and all those components, again, interdisciplinary. And finally, kind of the outreach and how we communicate. And it makes me think of all of the water groups, water partnerships, especially here in the Front Range, that came to be after the 2013 flood. And they're trying to do a good job of being the conduit between the science and the people who are actually on the ground. So with kind of those thoughts, I'll ask the panel to share their ideas on education, where do we need to go, and kind of outreach, engagement, and getting the word across.
So it's pretty clear that the information deficit model, this idea that people only need, if they only had more information, they would take it all and incorporate it. I think the scientific community has gotten its head handed to itself, frankly, in recent years, especially around climate change with regard to this, right? We've done assessment after assessment, report after report, and we've still missed a huge part of the U.S. who, for whatever reason, can't deal with what's coming at us. And I would just argue that argues for a lot of introspection on how to do it better. It's got to be a more inclusive process. It's got to be sort of the classic co-production of knowledge. No one has all the answers here. We need to put all of our heads together and figure out how to make the information dissemination work better. You know, again, that program that I ran at the University of Colorado, I mean, we made the decision makers, we worked with co-authors on papers, not that they particularly cared about that, but it was a way of honoring their knowledge, what they brought to the table. And I would argue the university systems in general could do more of that and be more effective with that. I don't have great answers here other than to know, again, being respectful of people's knowledge and trying to incorporate that along with the science knowledge, using social science to tell us what works and what doesn't, all really, really important here. And the information deficit hasn't worked, it won't work, we need to rethink it.
And Steve, I'll just build on that and say that, as I mentioned before, Brad's done tremendous research, and we have, we don't have, it's not the lack of information. I think that at some point we're missing a critical element of this, which is that I saw an article in the Los Angeles Times recently about utilizing human interest stories that we might be better able to convey to folks that need these kinds of relatable examples, really talking about the people that we know throughout the basin, as we see stories of farmers, having to abandon their lifelong operations due to these massive impacts. I think that turns into something that we can build on and then bring the good data to bear, or at least, develop action plans.
I would just follow up by thinking, again, this integrated approach that seems to be kind of thematic across our different comments, rather than the hydrologic cycle, thinking about the hydrosocial cycle, and how do we start to integrate all of these things across, say, the need for understanding water, the physicality of water and the ecological components, social power that has to do with the institutional structure, and technology and infrastructure, which has to do with water delivery and how we actually transform water into our needs. So thinking about that cycle in a very different way that's holistic, that demands all these different pieces of data that we've been talking about, and how we might start to have this discussion around that kind of a framework.
Final words.
Yes. I don't have anything more to add.
Well, with that yes, let's give them all a round of applause.